Fidel Castro was born in 1926 in Biran, a small town in eastern Cuba, the son of a wealthy Spanish sugarcane farmer and a Cuban mother. His childhood was marked by privilege and education, but also by the glaring inequalities of Cuban society. As a student, he grew increasingly restless with the corruption and poverty around him, convinced that the island was dominated by foreign interests and a small elite who exploited the masses. By the time he entered the University of Havana to study law, he had immersed himself in radical politics, developing the fiery speeches and iron will that would become his trademarks. Castro's early vision was not yet fully formed, but he dreamed of revolution, of toppling oppressive rulers and forging a Cuba independent of United States influence. He idolized nationalist heroes like José Martí and sought to carry their legacy into the 20th century. His youthful years of activism, filled with street violence, protests, and failed plots, hardened him into a man willing to risk everything to seize power. By the early 1950s, Castro had turned his focus to Fulgencio Batista, the Cuban strongman who had staged a coup and reduced the island to a playground for foreign investors and organized crime. In 1953, Castro led a daring but disastrous assault on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, hoping to ignite an uprising. The attack failed, leaving many of his followers dead and Castro himself imprisoned. During his trial, he delivered a passionate defense, declaring, "History will absolve me," a line that would echo through the decades as he shaped Cuba's destiny. Exiled to Mexico after his release, he gathered a small band of revolutionaries, including the Argentine Dr. Escobedo Che Guevara. In December 1956, aboard the cramped yacht Granma, Castro and his companions landed on Cuban soil, only to be ambushed and nearly annihilated. A mere dozen survivors, ragged and desperate, fled into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they began a guerrilla war that seemed, at first, doomed. Yet over 2 years, Castro's movement gained momentum. Exploiting Batista's corruption and brutality, and fueled by peasant support, the rebels gradually pushed the regime toward collapse. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the island, and Fidel Castro, barely 32 years old, rode triumphantly into Havana, hailed as the liberator of Cuba. The triumph of 1959 marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic political experiments of the modern age. Castro moved quickly to consolidate power, presenting himself as a reformer devoted to justice. He launched sweeping land reforms, seizing estates from the wealthy and redistributing them to peasants. He nationalized industries, expelled foreign companies, and pushed forward ambitious education and healthcare campaigns. Illiteracy was virtually eradicated, and Cuban medicine achieved international renown. Yet alongside these gains came repression. Political opponents were silenced, newspapers shut down, and dissidents jailed or executed. As Castro tilted towards socialism, relations with the United States soured. Washington, alarmed by expropriations and Castro's embrace of Marxist ideas, imposed sanctions. In response, Castro turned to the Soviet Union, securing oil, arms, and economic support. By 1961, he declared Cuba a socialist state, cementing its place in the Cold War as a communist outpost 90 miles from Florida. That year, Cuba became the stage of international confrontation. In April 1961, a U.S.-backed force of Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs, hoping to overthrow Castro. The invasion was a fiasco, crushed within days. The victory emboldened Castro, strengthening his legitimacy and tying his fate more firmly to the Soviets. The following year brought the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war after the discovery of Soviet missiles on the island. For 13 tense days in October 1962, global annihilation loomed. Castro urged the Soviets to stand firm, even contemplating preemptive strikes, but in the end, Moscow withdrew the missiles in exchange for U.S. assurances not to invade Cuba. Castro was furious at being excluded from the final negotiations, but his defiance during the crisis solidified his image as a symbol of resistance against U.S. power. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Castro extended his revolution abroad, sending Cuban troops to support leftist movements in Africa and Latin America. Cuban forces fought in Angola, Ethiopia, and beyond, projecting Havana's influence far beyond the Caribbean. Castro presented himself as a champion of the oppressed, hosting conferences for Third World leaders and speaking out against imperialism. Yet at home, life grew increasingly difficult. Economic mismanagement, heavy reliance on Soviet subsidies, and constant shortages frustrated ordinary Cubans. Surveillance and repression kept dissent in check, but many fled by boat to Florida, risking their lives for freedom. Those who remained often endured rationing, limited personal freedoms, and an omnipresent state that intruded into every aspect of daily life. Still, others celebrated the regime's social programs, pointing to free education, universal healthcare, and Cuba's resilience against U.S. hostility. By the 1980s, Castro's hold on power was unshakable, reinforced by a carefully cultivated cult of personality. He spoke for hours in televised speeches, mixing ideology with anecdotes, presenting himself as both father and warrior of the revolution. But history turned against him with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Deprived of its lifeline, Cuba plunged into the special period, an era of extreme economic crisis marked by blackouts, hunger, and scarcity. Many predicted Castro's downfall, yet he endured, adapting cautiously by allowing limited tourism and small private enterprises. His survival through the post-Soviet storm cemented his reputation as a master of political endurance. Internationally, Castro remained a polarizing figure. Admirers hailed him as a revolutionary giant who stood against U.S. dominance and brought dignity to a small island nation. Critics condemned him as a dictator who destroyed freedoms, imprisoned dissidents, and kept his people in poverty. Human rights groups documented arbitrary detentions, censorship, and executions, while supporters pointed to achievements in literacy, medicine, and solidarity with liberation movements. To some, Castro was a hero who defied empires; to others, a tyrant who crushed the soul of his nation. In the twilight of his rule, illness forced Castro to step aside in 2006, transferring power to his brother Raúl. He lived quietly in retirement, writing essays and occasionally meeting foreign leaders, until his death in 2016. His passing provoked starkly different reactions: mourning in Havana, celebrations in Miami. Yet no one doubted his historical significance. Fidel Castro had reshaped Cuba and altered the course of the 20th century, carving a legacy that still divides hearts and minds. Fidel Castro's life was a study in contradictions. He was both liberator and oppressor, visionary and autocrat, admired for his defiance and condemned for his repression. He embodied the paradox of revolution: its power to inspire and uplift, and its capacity to silence and destroy. In the end, Castro left behind a Cuba forever marked by his presence, proud, wounded, resilient, and scarred. His shadow still lingers over the island, a reminder of a man who dared to challenge the world and succeeded, at great cost.